Thank you for staying with us, folks. Our guest is Baba Lumumba from Umoja House in Washington, D.C., discussing Malcolm. And this would have been Malcolm's 95th birthday. The number to call to speak to Baba Lumumba, 800-450-7876. And before we left for the break, Ms. Richardson, calling us from Chevy Chase in Maryland, had a question for you, Baba Lumumba. And I guess she wants you to step into Malcolm's mind, if you will, and tell us what he would think. And basically, it's about the immigration problem. What would he say about the immigration problem? Your thoughts?
Well, I understand her to have her focus on money as an example of something that has changed in our community. And I have discussion with people often. A friend of mine has a very thriving greeting card business, Brother Kofi Tyeth. I mentioned him on the air. He's been working at his business for many years. He used to have his cards in many stores across the country, many black stores, black bookstores, black gift shops, etc., around African themes that in the 60s and 70s we had developed many businesses. And he pointed out to me that most of those businesses had closed down. They were not successful. We didn't succeed at that. And I remember when I was 15, 16 years old, getting together with the older brothers and talking about starting businesses. We had something we would call the Akbar Sound Company, and we were going to change our economics, and we felt that the economics was a fundamental aspect of our condition, and if we change that, then we would be well on our way to altering and affecting our collective and political circumstances. But what we found, and one of the things that, looking back on it, that those things have changed. I remember when Marion Barry was the mayor of D.C., how much progress we made, how many businesses that black folks have here. Now, we literally have almost none. In the city that we were 75% of the population in political control of, with the highest level of education, with Howard University, with more black people in this area, D.C. and Montgomery County, with money than any place probably in the world. And now we find ourselves in the year 2200 being deprived to not even being able to maintain our neighborhoods. We gentrified out. We have no businesses. We don't have a restaurant. We don't have a hotel that black people own. Well, we see businesses coming in town, other people doing better, even with black themes, doing better than us. So what happened to us? How should we look at this situation in which we find ourselves? I know that she's old enough to have felt that, to experience that. And so we have to address these problems. And I would contend, and I try to say this all the time when I'm on your show, is that our problem, the lack of finances is a symptom of our problem. It's not going to solve our problem. Our problem fundamentally is a cultural problem. It's a recognition of our need for independence. It is a cultural base in which to build that independence. It's our relationship to each other that's suffering. It's our solidarity that's the problem. And Malcolm understood that at a fundamental level. But he also remembered Malcolm was growing too. He would have changed. He would have evolved to some degree. And we saw that in him when he left the Nation of Islam, when he created Muslim Mosque Incorporated, when he created the Association of Afro-American Unity. You saw him evolving and changing, looking at things differently, growing, developing. And we have kind of not grown and developed the movement of black nationalists, the movement of Pan-African nationalists, whatever term you wish to use, hasn't really developed. When we look back at what the 60s and 70s gave us, whether it's Black is Beautiful, whatever it was that we developed, whether it was the Panthers, whether it was the Civil Rights Movement, or whether it was African Liberation Movement, whatever we had in that period, whatever we developed in that period, most of that is gone at this point. Most of that has not stood the test of time. There's two elements, I would say, that have stood the test of time. One is Kwanzaa, which has been a powerful force, and I say this all the time, and defining an alternative framework on which to function from as a black person. The other one is this brother Malcolm that we're talking about today. the power of this brother is so strong that he affects us. We are talking about now the reality of who this brother was, what he stood for. But it's not just important to talk about him, the person. It's his message and what he stood for. It is the fact that he's continuing the message of a Marcus Garvey. And when I think about that, realize that Elijah Muhammad continued the message of a Marcus Garvey. But Malcolm didn't create the Nation of Islam, but he was responsible for growing it. And I don't think anybody can refute that. His source, in this case, we're talking about the Garvey as a source, inspired Elijah Muhammad, it inspired his parents, it inspired him to become what he became, which was this critical stepladder for us, this critical junction that we have to come to grips with in terms of his meaning now. His leadership has to be duplicated, has to be transferred to the next generation. We have to understand it as a continuum towards, and we will have setbacks. We will have periods in which our views and our outlooks are running high, and we'll have periods in which they seem to be low, we seem to be put upon, we seem to be affected, on the low, if you will. But, that's to be expected. And like Peter was saying earlier, we need to gather those people who retain essentially the fundamental elements of our progress, which is self-reliance, which is independence, which is developing an alternative system, not trying to assimilate and be throwing our eggs in the basket of becoming a part of the system who will never accept us. They brought us here as workers, as subservient entities, and as far as they're concerned, we will remain that. That's all
right.
they want.
But you know what, Bamba Lumumba, I want to go back to one of the attributes of Brother Malcolm that you mentioned. You mentioned that he had the ability to identify with the masses. And where did he get that from? Was this something it was sort of just being hanging out in the streets, or was it part of the incarceration and I guess his change whilst he was behind bars? Where did he get that from? Because he could talk to anybody from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I think it rests with the love and the ability to identify with the masses. He loved his people. He had his connection with his people was such a basic fundamental level that he couldn't help himself but love his people. That he also saw in them the pain that he had gone through, and the fact that he went to jail. You can't minimize jail as one is that part of his life which allowed him to put a lot of things together. When he went to jail, he became one of them. He's in jail like the rest of them are in jail. Now, some of them are in jail for things they did do, and some are in jail for things they didn't do. So, but he could understand that. He could understand what that meant.
Well, let me interrupt you and ask you this then. Had he not been incarcerated, would he be a Malcolm X?
I would say no. If he had not been incarcerated, first of all, he would not have hooked up with the Nation of Islam. If he had not been incarcerated, then he would not have turned to the Nation of Islam. He would not have learned to connect with, he would not have been forced to go back to his parents' understanding of life as the basis for him moving forward. All that happened in jail. And in jail, he was able to study. He was able to read. He was able to become sophisticated. Jail was his university. But it was a university that served all of us better than any university would have served us. If you look at Malcolm, compare him to Du Bois or compare him to any other academic, what you find is that he's head and shoulders in terms of value than all of them. What he gave us is so much more valuable than our academicians, that are so-called talented tenth. His university was the jail. It allowed all those things to come together and produce what we know as this valuable person. That also means to us that this idea of elitism, this idea that our leaders have to be sophisticated, quote, educated in the system, is a bogus idea. And he exemplified that. Malcolm showed us that our greatest leaders will not come from the talented 10. They will not come from universities. They just won't. Universities put them more in the box than they do out of the box. It is necessary for a leader for the black community to exist outside the box, not to be entrenched in, confined by the constraints that universities automatically produce in things. I wouldn't say automatically, because many people do escape that. I'm not going to condemn it. I mean, I would be condemning myself if I did that. So I can't say that you can't escape the confines of an education in a university, but it's also very difficult. The fact that he did not go to a university, that he went to prison, and that was his university, turns out to be a big asset and turns out to be a critical element in why he was what he was and why he was so valuable to us.
Are you saying that he couldn't have developed that way outside the prison system? He could, in fact, even with his parents as Garveyites?
Without that prison experience, Malcolm would have had much less value to us than he has today. Much less. Now, whether he would or not, because no one could actually say that absolutely. And I'm not saying that. I'm suggesting that in fact may be the case. That his prison experience, and that we need to look. It is those brothers and sisters who spend time in jail probably end up having a value to us that we have to realize. It's very, very important.
Right. Hold that thought right there, because we're going to take this short break, and I'll let you explain that on the other side. Folks, our guest is Brother Baba Lumumba from Umoja House in Washington, D.C. You want to speak to him and talk about Brother Malcolm? Reach out to us, 800-450